The Quarterly, the Book of Isaiah, Lesson 3, Isaiah 7:1 to 8:8, the Promise of Immanuel. In this passage, we've moved on from the end of Uzziah's reign to the reign of his grandson, King Ahaz, even though only about 5 years have passed. These oracles of judgment and hope are given in the context of the war between Judah and a coalition of the northern kingdom of Israel and Syria, or Aram, that took place in 734 to 732 BC. Ahaz, king of Judah, was seriously threatened by the alliance that had been formed by Pekah, king of Israel, and Rezin, king of Syria, to provide mutual help in their revolt against the king of Assyria. And you can read about that in 2 Kings 16:5 to 18, or 2 Chronicles 28:16 to 21. Now when King Ahaz refused to join them, they threatened to invade Judah and to place a puppet king on the throne to fight with them against Assyria. As a result, the royal household was filled with fear, though, as the house of David, verse 2, they should have remembered God's promises to David in 2 Samuel 7 and Psalm 2. Their fear was the result of their attention being focused on their problem rather than on their God. So the prophet Isaiah was sent with a message for King Ahaz, along with Isaiah's son, who was named Shear-Yashuv. A remnant will return. Verse 3. Both Isaiah's own name, Yahweh Saves, and his son's name should have been encouragements to Ahaz all in themselves, although both names certainly suggest a context of difficulty and even God's sweeping judgment upon the people. Isaiah found King Ahaz out by the upper pool, checking on Jerusalem's water supply, which would of course be a critical factor in any extended siege of the city. Immediately, Isaiah told Ahaz not to be afraid or anxious. The plans of Syria and Israel against Judah and Jerusalem would come to nothing. What Ahaz had feared would be an all-consuming forest fire was actually nothing more than a couple of smoldering sticks. 2 of their leaders didn't even deserve to be named in the message. Pekah and the putative puppet king of Judah are only referred to as the sons of non-entities in verses 4 to 6, while Ahaz is the son of David. In less than an ordinary lifetime of 70 years, the northern kingdom of Israel would be destroyed, along with her Syrian allies. All Ahaz needed to do was to stand firm by faith in the Lord. Verse 9. Now when Ahaz didn't respond, God graciously offered him help for his weak faith in the form of a sign. He could have any sign he wanted, from the deepest depths to the highest heights. Verse 11. Nor was this an empty promise on the Lord's part. Later in the book of Isaiah, God gave Ahaz's son Hezekiah a dramatic sign of his favor when he was ill, making the sun go back 10 steps on the primitive sundial in the royal house. Chapter 38, verse 8. But Ahaz was not about to ask for a sign from the Lord. He'd already made up his mind to trust in Assyria. A sign would merely have been embarrassing. But Ahaz managed to make his unbelief sound spiritual, saying, "Oh, I will not put the Lord to the test," verse 12. He's actually quoting Deuteronomy 6:16 back at God. However, God will not let him get away with that. As Isaiah declares, he is wearying God, now referred to as my, that is, Isaiah's God, and no longer your, Ahaz's God, as he was in verse 10. Even if Ahaz doesn't ask for a sign, God is going to give him one. But now it will be a sign of God's choosing. And the Lord chooses to give Ahaz a sign which calls for faith, the sign of Immanuel. He could have had any sign he wanted, but now he will have to settle for a natural sign, a weak sign. A virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son, and she will name him Immanuel. Verse 14. It's important to recognize that the sign of Immanuel works on 2 distinct levels. On the one hand, With the benefit of hindsight, we read it as a prophecy of the Lord Jesus, and of course such it is, as Matthew tells us in Matthew 1:23. But it was also intended to be a sign to Ahaz and his court. For by the time this infant reached a few years of age, the kingdoms of Israel and Syria would no longer be a threat to Judah. Verse 16. And this dual fulfillment is possible because the word translated virgin in English has a broader meaning in Hebrew. It means a young woman who's recently reached physical maturity and therefore is ready to get married. In that culture, that was normally a close connection between these two events, which would typically take place in their early teens. What could be more normal than a young woman of marriageable age getting married, becoming pregnant, and giving birth to a son? There's no requirement that there's any miracle involved in that original conception. Yet what is significant in the gift of the original Immanuel child is the faith of this very ordinary young mother in giving to her son the name Immanuel, which means God is with us, or God is on our side. We're presented with a stark contrast. The king of Judah, the anointed son of David, did not believe that God was present with power to save Judah from the assault of Israel and Syria, but this young mother did. And her faith stands as a further condemnation of Ahaz's lack of trust. Isaiah spelled out the consequences of Ahaz's unbelief in the rest of chapter 7. In the short term, everything would go well for him and for Judah. By the time the boy Immanuel was a few years old enough to know right from wrong, Israel and Syria would have been laid waste by the Lord. Verse 16. Ahaz would learn that God is faithful to his promise. God is able to deliver his people, even by means of the Assyrian invaders. There would be a temporary period of prosperity, symbolized by an abundance of the traditional sign of the royal foods of curds and honey. Verse 15. That was the good news. Now for the bad news. Ahaz, if you're going to call on Assyria for help, you're going to get far more than you bargained for. Assyria was going to be God's weapon of judgment against him and Israel for their unbelief. There are a series of 4 "in that day" statements. Verse 18, 20, 21, and 23, that spell out this coming disaster. The king of Assyria would not stop once he had conquered Israel and Syria, as Ahaz had asked him to. The hired knife that Ahaz had brought in would shave him clean, or, as we might say, would skin him alive. A fitting metaphor, given the prevalence of that particular Assyrian punishment, as can be seen from the reliefs that show Sennacherib's assault on the Judean city of Lachish that are on display in the British Museum. His hastening to the plunder would sweep over the land of Judah as well, and the result would be devastation that stretched across Immanuel's land. Chapter 8, verse 8. Even those traditional signs of prosperity, curds and honey, which were a blessing in verse 15, become a curse by verse 22, because curds and honey are the only food that they have left to eat. The agricultural land would become utterly desolate, devoid of fruit, overgrown with briars. All that would be left were the products of a nomadic life. In focusing his fear on Israel and Syria, Ahaz had completely missed the far greater threat that was represented by Assyria, and behind Assyria, by the Lord. The message of impending judgment continues on into chapter 8. The prophet is instructed to make a sign and set it up with the name that predicted the dismal future, belonging to Mahar-shalal-Hashbaz, which means hastening to the plunder, hurrying to the spoil. This message is to be clearly and comprehensively displayed and witnessed by reliable people. This billboard message was confirmed through the birth of a son for Isaiah and his wife, the prophetess, who was to be given the same ominous name, Mahar-shalal-Hashbaz. The similarity between chapter 8 verse 4 and chapter 7 verse 16, along with the reference to Immanuel's land in chapter 8 verse 8, suggests that this child may have been the initial fulfillment of that Immanuel prophecy. It's not unusual for children in biblical times to be given more than one name. Verses 5 through 8 confirm the ominous sign. Jerusalem will soon be up to her neck in trouble. They rejoiced over the downfall of Rezin and Remaliah at the hands of the Assyrians, but in the process they had rejected Shiloh, the small stream from the Gihon spring that fed Jerusalem. Remember, the issue of Jerusalem's secure water supply was where this episode started out in chapter 7, verse 3. In rejecting the still small stream of trusting in the Lord's protection and provision, they would find out that the roaring river of Assyria was uncontrollable. Like a raging torrent, once she breached her boundaries, there would be no stopping her. But even this earth-shaking judgment is under the Lord's sovereign control. Chapter 8, verse 7. Assyria will not completely sweep Judah away. She would be up to her neck in trouble, but she would not drown. God would still be with his people in the midst of their deep distress. Application questions. 1. What situations have you encountered that required you to demonstrate faith in God in the face of really challenging circumstances? 2. Ahaz thought trusting in Assyria was the safe option. What do you tend to trust in instead of trusting in God? 3. How is the promise of Immanuel good news for Ahaz? 4. How is the promise of Immanuel good news for us?